Survivors, Flood, Mississippi, 1927. Chapter 4. Wednesday. Molly got up early. With half her mind worrying about the lightning tree, she fed the chickens, set out the lettuce plants her mother had started in the cold frame, fed the pigs, cleared off the old bean stalks from the picket fence. The garden was soppy. When she dug the little holes for the lettuce plants, they seeped half full of water. Her mother was going to be upset if they just rotted in the ground, but Molly was pretty sure that was what was going to happen. Meacham and Lawrence and her father spent the early afternoon walking the levee again. By late afternoon, Molly was watching for a chance to slip away. Her mother kept glancing at her. "Molly, you are acting like a nervous colt. What in the world is the matter? Is the rain on your nerves, too?" Molly shrugged. She and Garrett had made a pact. They would never tell anyone else about the money jar. Ever. She tried not to look out the little kitchen window. It would do no good. The lightning tree had either fallen, or it hadn't. No amount of stewing would make a difference. "What is on your mind, child?" Molly looked up at her mother. She was mending. Hope was at her feet, playing with a basket full of empty thread spools, clacking the wood together and murmuring quietly to herself. "I am so tired of rain," Molly said softly. Her mother set her mending aside and stood up, her stockinged feet silent on the linoleum. She put her arms around Molly and hugged her hard for a few seconds. "Would you go cut some cane for garden stakes? I want to tie up the sweet peas this year. See if we can't keep the beetles out of them. And you can keep an eye out for that tawny hen." Molly stood up so quickly that she saw a look of surprise cross her mother's face. She half turned to avoid her mother's studying eyes. "Take the hand axe for the crane," her mother said, "and some twine to tie up the bundles." Molly went into the kitchen and pulled open the bottom drawer of the Hoosier cabinet. The hand axe lay on top of the garden trowels and Papa's tin snips. She pulled it out, then straightened up and got the garden knife from the sideboard. Mamma reached up to take the ball of twine down from its shelf and wound a length of it around her fingers. Molly fished a salt sack out of the bin and put the axe in it. "Be careful," her mother said, holding out the twine between her hands. Molly cut it, then put the ball her mother had wound into the sack along with the knife. "Watch where you're walking, and not just for snakes," her mother was saying. "Did I tell you that Dudley Stanton saw a bobcat less than a stone's throw from their porch in the middle of the day?" "I'm always careful," Molly told her. Hope was trying to stand. Molly's mother reached down to help her, looking up just once as Molly went out the door. "You'll be back before dark." "I will," Molly promised, then turned and skipped down the steps, slinging the sack over her shoulder. She waded through the worst of the water in the yard, then crossed behind the chicken coop, following the path along the edge of the big field. There in the distance she could see the top of the lightning tree. It still slanted, but it hadn't fallen yet. Once she knew her mother couldn't see her, she started to run. The tallest stand of cane was just east of the old log bridge. She whistled twice. When Garrett didn't answer, she chopped one stout piece of cane and used it to beat noisily against the stand. She kept up the clatter long enough to scare any snake into showing itself. Then she set to work. She chopped stalk after stalk with the hand axe. Then, careful of the razor-sharp edges where the cane had shattered, she trimmed the narrow, stiff leaves near the top. As she knotted the twine around two good-sized bundles, she kept glancing off toward the bridge. The afternoon cool had settled in. It'd be dusky before too much longer. Where was Garrett? She put everything back in the sack, then shouldered it, wishing she hadn't promised him she wouldn't try alone. What if he couldn't come? Just then she heard his high-pitched whistle and ran to meet him. As he crossed the bridge, "Did you see it? It's still standing!" Garrett came across before he answered. His cheeks were flushed and he was breathing hard. "I came down to check on my way home from Mr. Lawler's," he told her without breaking stride. "The water's a lot higher than when we were here last, Molly." Molly shrugged. "If we don't get our money now, Garrett, we may never." She glanced back at the bundles of cane. "Mamma sent me to cut garden stakes. Let's carry them with us. It'll help you get them home once we get in the jar." Molly led the way. The cane was heavy and awkward, and they had to walk slowly through the woods. Molly dumped her bundle near the raft and dropped the sack beside it. "I've got a hand axe, some twine, and a knife in there, if that helps us any." Garrett let his cane bundle slide to the ground. "Might. Bring the sack anyway." Molly nodded, staring at the high water. "Did you see if the poles are still where we left them?" Garrett nodded. "I'll get them." Molly watched him sprint toward a big willow tree and disappear under its drooping branches. A moment later he emerged, carrying both poles. His was longer and a little heavier. They had spent hours scrubbing them with sand to smooth the wood. "Ready?" Garrett nodded at her. They laid their poles across the logs. Then Molly helped him drag the raft across the shallows. The bottom was muddy. Once they were wading in water up to their knees. Molly slung her sack onto the raft. She turned to sit down on the log, swinging her legs around quickly before the raft had time to tilt. As Garrett got on, she leaned to balance his weight. She picked up her pole and held it ready, waiting. Together they pushed off, guiding the raft out onto the dark water. The pole felt familiar in Molly's hands. Rafting reminded her of summer, of days so hot the bayou water was warm to the touch. Guiding the raft carefully, they worked together to position it as close to the trunk of the lightning tree as they could. Once it was alongside, Garrett jabbed his pole into the mud, angling it against the raft to hold it steady. "You brace from that side," he said. Molly nodded, sinking the end of her pole in the mud as he had done, but keeping hold of it. She watched as he stood cautiously straightening up until he was sure of his balance. Then he leaned out and grasped the low branch of the lightning tree. He scrambled upward, quick and agile, and Molly allowed herself a smile. In a moment they would have their money, and all they would have to do would be to figure out another hiding place for the jar. It was getting dark fast, and Molly glanced up at the sky. Clouds were closing in, thickening. Nightfall would come early. A loud cracking sound startled her out of her thoughts. Garrett was halfway up now, clinging to the trunk where it tapered into a slender column. "It's falling!" he shouted. The tree slowly sagging away from Molly. Then, with an eerie moaning sound, it dropped abruptly, twigs shattering in an explosion of sharp cracks. "Garrett!" Molly screamed, standing up without thinking, then spreading her arms for balance. The lightning tree had crashed at an angle, the top wedging itself into the branches of a hackberry that stood at the edge of the water. Garrett had fallen, and she, reached to jerk his pole from the mud, then her own. Seconds later she was pulling toward him. "I'm all right," he called, "so long as there's no cottonmouths around." He tried to laugh, but she could hear how uneasy he was. She leaned to counter his weight as he rolled onto the raft and lay still, breathing hard. "The jar is safe now, anyway. Nothing could bring that tree down from where it stuck." He fell silent, and Molly listened to the sound of mosquitoes buzzing in the thickening dusk. "I have to get home," she said finally, "or Ma's going to stop letting me come." Garrett nodded. Molly pulled them to the water's edge, and they pulled the raft out. She looked off through the trees. It was getting too dark to carry the cane back through the woods. "I'll have to leave the cane here until morning." "We should drag the raft up onto the levee road," Garrett said. "We could hide it along the stretch by your place. You know where the willow grows so thick?" Molly nodded. "I'll help, but then I have to go." She stared at the raft, then looked up the long slope of the levee, getting an idea. "Hey," she said, "we could put the raft in the river and load it with the cane. Then we could just walk the whole mess along the levee like a dog on a rope. It'll be a lot faster." "That'd work, I think. We'd only have to carry the cane the last little bit past the willow patch, and it'd sure be easier to let the river do the hauling between here and there." They set to work, loading the cane on the raft. Then they pulled slowly across the backwater, using it as a roadway to the levee. At the water's edge, they unloaded the raft, leaving the cane on the slope. They dragged the raft up onto the levee road. It was hard, but they managed. Then they went back down for the cane. Molly fashioned a tow rope out of her twine, tripling it for strength. She laid her sack beside the stacks of cane, and their poles. Then they set off. Molly held the twine. The raft came along easily. "You're smart, Molly," Garrett shouted at her over the sound of the river. She grinned and looked up at the sky. The last of the light was dimming. Her mother was going to be upset, but at least now she could say it was bringing the cane home that slowed her down. The raft butted into the levee, and Molly had to push it out with her foot. Another few steps, and it veered into the levee again. "I'll ride," Garrett said. "I can use my pole to nudge it out now and then so it stops getting stuck." Before Molly could protest, he was climbing on, settling himself, leaning carefully to pick up his pole. She tugged at the twine. "You're heavy," she yelled, teasing him. She pulled harder. The sudden resistance surprised her. It was as if someone had loaded rocks onto the raft. "What's wrong?" Garrett asked. He pushed lightly on the levee to move the raft away from the bank. "Don't!" Molly warned him. She could barely hold the twine now. It was cutting into her palm. "There's a current or something," she said, her feet beginning to slide in the mud. The twine snapped, and she sat down hard, then sprang up, staring as the raft slid away from her. "Your pole!" Garrett extended it. Molly grabbed the end and hauled backward, but the current that had taken hold of the raft was strong. It was swift and sinuous, its path through the slower water marked with ripples and foam, barely visible in the dying light. "Let go!" Garrett shouted at her above the sound of the rushing water, but it was too late. Molly was sliding down into the river, pedaling with her feet in the mud. Then, as the current jerked her forward, she felt the cold water close over her head.